I've just been reading a short chapter about how the mind matters in Tanya Luhrmann's book, How God Becomes Real. It's a particularly interesting chapter, really. Here we witness Luhrmann developing her argument about how effort must be made in order for people to experience gods and spirits in a real way. In previous chapters, Luhrmann has talked about some of the things that contribute to this feeling of realness in regards to gods and spirits, including a concept called absorption. In this chapter, she claims that these are not the only things that contribute to this feeling, but it is also affected by people's perceptions and understandings of their own inner and outer world, as well as something we will come to talk about shortly, the space called the in-between. In this presentation, I will guide you through the ideas presented in this chapter. So join me, and together we will journey through Chapter 4, How the Mind Matters, of Tanya Luhrmann's book, How God Becomes Real. Chapter 4, Tanya Luhrmann, How the Mind Matters. Okay, enough of that. Here we go, we're on to it. Okay, so like I said, this chapter is all about the effect that different ways of perceiving the relationship between inner and outer stuff has on how gods and spirits become real to people. Luhrmann's very quick to define the words that she uses, so I'll do the same really quickly just here. Inner and outer, here we're referring to the ways that people perceive spirits or gods communicating with them. Inner being what many of us would consider inside our mind and the personal sphere of our own minds, our thoughts and these sorts of things. Outer being external influences, and if you were to actually hear something with your ears or something like that. And then there's the space of the in-between, which is, as it sounds, in between these two sort of variations of senses. And as we'll see later on, depending on background or your perception of these senses, some find that concept easier to grasp or are more familiar with it than others. But I digress a bit there. There are 4 main steps in this chapter. 1. Luhrmann introduces us to the concept of different models of mind. These are the different ways of perceiving the previously mentioned variations of senses. 2. She familiarises us with the in-between. 3. She explains to us just how important the mind itself is when it comes to judgments and perceptions in regards to kindling faith. And finally, she provides us with her evidence and what conclusions she has come to through her own studies that took place in 3 similar churches in 3 different parts of the world. Okay, summary. Like previous chapters of the book, Luhrmann does a nice job of setting the chapter up into nice little sections. She begins by reassuring us how interconnected faith is with the mind. Because we do not perceive gods and spirits as we do most things in our world, mind and imagination are important tools in manifesting the sense of realness felt by those of faith. Here Luhrmann states her intentions for the chapter and introduces us to models of the mind. These are the different ways that one can think of their own thoughts and how they relate to the world around them. For some, inner world is a strictly personal space, but for others, one's thoughts can have a direct impact on the world around them. And it's this variation that Luhrmann considers to be a crucial point that affects how people make gods real. First up, Luhrmann introduces us to the in-between. Luhrmann calls this a domain that is felt to be neither in a person's own inner awareness nor in the everyday world. We're given numerous examples here of people, mostly from the States at this stage, referring to this space in their experiences. And we're also given an example of how the space can be seen in some experiences of psychosis. But Luhrmann clarifies that she's not comparing religious experience to mental illness, but rather stating that they do work in the same space. This is an important point for Luhrmann to share with us because it serves as the domain for much of her evidence of how gods and spirits communicate with people. But because it is a rather ambiguous realm in itself, Luhrmann claims that the way this realm is perceived has a big impact on how the events are received by the experiencer. And this is how we come to our next point. the mind. Here Luhrmann gives us some examples of just how differently thought and the mind can be perceived. This comes back to what I mentioned earlier about how for some the mind is a very personal and separate space from everything else in the world. But for others, thought and things that go on within can have a real effect on the world around them. When we consider these vastly different awarenesses of the mind, it's easy to understand Luhrmann's claims about how they can, as she puts it herself, affect the way they experience the in-between, and thus the way they experience gods and spirits. Finally, after all the setup and explanation of key concepts, we arrive at what it all comes down to. Luhrmann's study, where she spends time with attendees of similar churches in the US, India and Ghana. This is where she gives all her evidence to support her claims of how different approaches to the mind and the in-between have a significant effect on how people develop their faith and experience their relationships with spirits and gods, or in this case, God. In this section, Luhrmann goes into great detail on her experiences during her research in these three locations. She takes on a far more narrative approach. She shares with us information on what prompted her to do this study, that being the overtly American way that her participants thought about their experiences during her research in evangelical churches in the US. She also gives vivid accounts of what she participated in the different countries. And finally, she draws her conclusions on the actual differences in how each country's participants typically thought about the mind, and by extension, the effect that this had on the ways they experienced God. To sum up these effects very briefly, Luhrmann's studies concluded that the American cohort tended to have a citadel mindset, where the mind is considered very separate from the exterior world. Luhrmann implies that this is reflected in how the Americans experienced God talking to them in their mind. In Chennai, the people were far more socially focused. Luhrmann describes their perspective of the mind being in relation to others. They are expected to know and consider what other significant people around them think about how they should conduct themselves. And through her research, Luhrmann says that this reflects in how they would experience God talking to them through other people. Lastly, in Accra, they seem to think of the mind as more of a continuum. It's a straight quote. Being far more familiar with the idea of thoughts carrying real power. And it seems that they experience God far more physically and actually in the body itself. Okay, strengths and weaknesses. Okay, strengths. Luhrmann's always very good at defining any concepts and vocabulary that she's going to be using. It's really good that she does a good job of that. The narrative style that she picked up in the research part of this chapter, I thought that worked really well to help you engage with the information. Now, I've really been enjoying this book, and I think Luhrmann does a really good job especially at keeping her chapters relevant and contributing to her overall idea that that to experience gods and spirits, one has to put effort into the relationship. But I was surprised to find that I maybe had more critiques for this one than I have with other chapters. Firstly, as much as I feel this concept of this chapter was relevant to her argument, I don't know if it was so important as to deserve such a long-winded chapter dedicated to it. I felt like a lot of it, particularly what she gained from her research in the States, India and Ghana, could have maybe been condensed a little bit. But then I understand if you put all this effort into going over and studying and, conducting these interviews and going there and that, then I can understand why she may have wanted to give it a fair bit of space. Secondly, I feel like she didn't acknowledge her position as more of an outsider in India and Ghana. And I thought that this should be taken into consideration when conducting comparative research, especially with, her home sort of country or something, a space she's maybe more familiar with. But hey, she's the pro and I'm the student. So, but I still, from this chapter, I certainly got the point of that the ways that people think about the mind and the space in between can certainly affect the ways that they receive and communicate with God and kindle their relationship with Him. That's chapter 4. Tanya Lerman. Better than Greer.